I was 72 years old when my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said something I never thought I'd hear in my own son's house. "You're not welcome here anymore." She said it like the decision had already been made, like I was just an old piece of furniture that didn't belong there anymore. For a moment, nobody spoke. My son just stood there, silent. And that was the moment I realized something that took me 40 years to understand. We were in their kitchen in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a beautiful house, the kind with high ceilings and desert views that cost more than I made in a decade working the docks in Savannah. I had moved in 6 months ago after my wife, Martha, passed away. I didn't want to be a burden, but my son, David, had insisted. He told me the guest suite was mine for as long as I lived, but David's wife, Sarah, never liked the arrangement. To her, I was a reminder of a life they'd left behind, a life that didn't involve expensive wine and weekend trips to Sedona. I'd spent my retirement savings helping David through law school and giving them the down payment for this very house. I thought that meant something. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sounding thinner than I wanted it to. She didn't flinch. She just set her coffee mug down on the marble counter with a sharp click. "We need the space, Robert. David's firm is expanding, and we need a proper home office. Plus, the kids are getting older. It's not working." I looked at David. He was staring at his shoes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. This was the boy I'd coached in Little League, the man I'd stood beside at his wedding. "David," I said. He finally looked up, but his eyes were cold. "Mom always said you were stubborn, Dad. Don't make this harder than it has to be. We found a place for you. It's a senior living community in Mesa. It's nice. You'll have people your own age." "A place?" I repeated. "You're putting me in a home?" "It's a transition," Sarah snapped. "And we've already signed the paperwork. We need you out by the end of the month." I felt a coldness settle in my chest, worse than the winter winds back in Georgia. They weren't just asking me to leave. They were disposing of me. "I gave you the money for this house," I said quietly. Sarah laughed, a short, ugly sound. "That was a gift, Robert. Gifts don't come with strings. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lunch meeting." She walked out of the room, her heels clicking on the tile like a countdown. David stayed for a second, looking like he wanted to say something, but then he just sighed and followed her. I stood there alone in that big, expensive kitchen. I realized then that they weren't waiting for me to get old. They were waiting for me to get out of the way. But they forgot one thing. They forgot who taught David how to negotiate, and they forgot exactly what I still had tucked away in a safe deposit box back home. I went back to the guest suite and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands weren't shaking, but my heart was drumming a rhythm I hadn't felt since my days working the docks. I looked at the photos on the nightstand. Martha and me on our 30th anniversary. David at his graduation. I had spent 42 years building a life based on the idea that family was a solid foundation, something meant to last. That evening, I didn't join them for dinner. I listened through the vents, much like I had heard others describe the hollow sounds of a house that was no longer a home. I heard Sarah's voice, sharp and clear. She was talking about the Mesa project, as if I were a renovation. She mentioned a place called Golden Oaks. I knew the reputation of those state-funded spots, places that smelled of industrial cleaner and forgotten lives. "He'll be fine, David," she said. "He's 72, not a child. He needs to face the reality that he can't contribute anymore." The next morning, I drove to my bank downtown. I'd been quiet about my finances for a long time. David and Sarah assumed that because I lived in their basement suite, I was surviving solely on a meager Social Security check. They didn't know about the private investments or the land I still owned back east. I sat down with a branch manager named Marcus, a man I'd known for years. I asked him to pull up my primary investment portfolio. When the screen turned toward me, the numbers were clear. Between the sale of my properties and the stocks Martha and I had sat on for decades, the balance was just north of $3 million. "Is there a problem, Robert?" Marcus asked. No, I said, my voice steady. I just need to make sure this is entirely separate. I want to move every cent into an irrevocable trust. I want it locked down so tight that even if someone were to get a power of attorney over me, they couldn't touch a nickel. He looked surprised but started the paperwork. As I signed my name, I thought about the down payment I'd given David. I thought about the formality of family trust that I'd seen others be betrayed by. When I got back to the house, Sarah was waiting in the driveway. She was wearing her workout gear, looking efficient and cold. The movers are coming on Tuesday, Robert, she said, without looking up from her phone. We've already packed most of the stuff you have in the garage. We're trying to make this as clean as possible. Clean for who, Sarah? I asked. She finally looked at me, her eyes narrowed. Don't make this emotional. We're doing what's necessary for our family. You should be happy we found a place that takes your insurance. I walked past her without a word. I went to the garage and saw my life boxed up in cheap cardboard. My tools, my books, Martha's old sewing machine, all of it pushed aside like trash. I realized they weren't just moving me out. They were erasing me. But as I felt the weight of the trust documents in my pocket, I knew I wasn't the one who was going to be erased. I spent that Saturday evening in the kitchen, making a final pot of coffee. I had been in this house for 6 months, and in that time, I had repaired the leaky sink, fixed the deck boards, and kept the garden from dying in the Arizona heat. I had treated it like my own because I thought it was. David came in while I was pouring a cup. He wouldn't look at the boxes in the hallway. He went straight for the refrigerator, grabbing a bottle of water and leaning against the counter. I spoke to the director at Golden Oaks, he said, his voice flat. They have a room ready. It's on the 2nd floor. It has a view of the courtyard. I'm sure it's a regular paradise, David, I replied. He finally looked at me, and I saw a flash of guilt, but it was quickly buried under a layer of defensiveness. Look, Dad, Sarah is right about the office. My billable hours are down because I'm constantly distracted here. We have to think about our future, the kids' college funds, the mortgage. It's a lot. I paid for your college, David. I paid for this house's down payment so you wouldn't have that stress, I said quietly. And we're grateful, he snapped, his voice rising. But that was years ago. Things change. You can't expect to hold that over our heads forever. It's not fair to Sarah, and it's not fair to me. I took a slow sip of the coffee. It was bitter. I'm not holding anything over you. I'm just wondering when the man I raised disappeared and was replaced by someone who talks about his father like a line item on a spreadsheet. David slammed his water bottle onto the counter. This is exactly why this isn't working. Everything is a guilt trip with you. You're moving on Tuesday. That's the end of it. He stormed out, and a few minutes later, I heard the muffled sound of an argument starting in their bedroom upstairs. I didn't need to hear the words to know they were talking about me. Monday morning, while they were both out, David at the office and Sarah at her yoga class, I made a phone call. I didn't call a moving company. I called a real estate attorney I had known for 30 years back in Georgia. I told him I needed to execute a sale on the mountain property I'd been holding on to. Are you sure, Robert? He asked. That land has been in your family for 3 generations. I'm sure, I told him. I need the liquidity. And I need it fast. By Monday afternoon, the paperwork was being faxed to a local office in Scottsdale. I was liquidating everything. If I was being kicked out of the home I helped buy, then I was going to make sure I left with every piece of leverage I had ever built. When Sarah came home that afternoon, she found me sitting on a lawn chair in the garage, surrounded by the boxes of my life. She looked at me with a mix of pity and annoyance. You should get some rest, Robert, she said. The van will be here at 8 in the morning. We've already handled the first month's deposit for you. Don't worry about the deposit, Sarah, I said, smiling for the first time in days. I've made my own arrangements. She paused, her hand on the door handle. What does that mean? It means you won't have to worry about me being a distraction anymore, I said, or an old piece of furniture. She rolled her eyes and went inside, dismissing me one last time. She didn't realize that while she was planning my transition into a nursing home, I was planning a transition that would leave them standing in a very empty house. Tuesday morning arrived with a gray, heavy sky that felt out of place for Arizona. I stood in the driveway as the moving van pulled up. It wasn't a professional service. It was a cheap, local outfit Sarah had hired to save money. I watched two young men begin loading the boxes containing my life. The tools I'd used to build David's first cradle, the books Martha had read to him at night, the small mementos of a 40-year marriage. Sarah stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching the process like a supervisor at a warehouse. She didn't offer a hand, and she didn't offer a kind word. David had already left for work, claiming he had an emergency meeting, though I knew he just couldn't bear to look me in the eye as I was hauled away. "The driver has the directions to Golden Oaks," Sarah said, stepping down from the porch as the last box went in. "We'll come by this weekend to see how you're settling in. Bring you some of your favorite snacks." "Don't bother, Sarah," I said, climbing into my old sedan. "Robert, don't be like that," she sighed. "We're doing this so we can all have a better life. You'll see." I didn't answer. I started the engine and followed the truck out of the neighborhood. But when we hit the main road, I didn't head toward Mesa. I pulled alongside the truck at a red light and waved the driver over to a gas station parking lot. I got out and handed him a $100 bill. "Change of plans," I told him. "I'm not going to Golden Oaks. I want you to take everything to a climate-controlled storage facility 3 miles from here. I've already prepaid for the unit." The driver looked at the money, then at me, and shrugged. "You're the boss, Pop." Once my belongings were safe and the truck was gone, I drove to a law office in the center of the city. I wasn't meeting with David's firm. I was meeting with a man named Harold Bennett, a specialist in real estate and elder law. I had sent him the original documents for David and Sarah's house the night before. The ones that showed my name wasn't just on a gift letter, but on a secondary lien I had placed on the property years ago as a protective measure Martha had insisted on. "It's ironclad, Robert," Harold said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Since they haven't made a payment on the private portion of the loan in 3 years, and since they are now attempting to move you against your will, you have the right to call the note due immediately." "And if they can't pay?" I asked. "Then the house goes into a forced sale," he replied. "You'll get your principal back, plus interest. They'll be left with whatever equity is left after the bank takes its cut, which won't be much in this market." I looked out the window at the Scottsdale skyline. I had given them everything, and they had tried to give me a concrete box in a state home. "Do it," I said. "File the papers this afternoon." I spent that night in a quiet, high-end hotel overlooking the valley. For the first time in months, I didn't hear Sarah's sharp voice or David's heavy, guilty sighs. I slept until 10 the next morning. My phone was vibrating on the nightstand when I woke up. It was David. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I watched the voicemail notification appear. A moment later, a text came through from Sarah. It was all capital letters. "What have you done? The bank just called. Robert, pick up the phone right now." I set the phone back down and ordered breakfast to my room. The war had started, and for the first time, I wasn't the one who was defenseless. I stayed in that hotel room for 2 days, watching the sun set over the desert, feeling a strange mix of grief and relief. My phone was a constant storm of notifications. David called 16 times. Sarah sent dozens of messages, alternating between screaming threats of legal action and sobbing pleas for me to be reasonable. They had been served with a formal notice to pay the outstanding $300,000 within 30 days or face a foreclosure sale. On Thursday afternoon, I finally agreed to meet them. I told them to come to the hotel lobby. I didn't want to be in that house anymore, and I didn't want to be in a place where Sarah could corner me in a hallway. I sat in a high-backed leather chair near the window, watching them walk in. They looked like they hadn't slept. Sarah's hair was a mess, and David's suit was wrinkled, a sight I never thought I'd see for a man who obsessed over his image. "Dad, what are you doing?" David asked, his voice cracking as he sat down across from me. A lien? You put a lien on our home without telling us? I told you when I gave you the money that it was a family investment, I said calmly. You signed the papers at the kitchen table while Martha was making tea. You just didn't think I'd ever hold you to the terms. We don't have that kind of money, Robert, Sarah hissed, leaning over the small table. Everything we have is tied up in the firm and the kids' schools. You're going to make us homeless. Your own grandchildren will have nowhere to go. You were perfectly fine making me homeless on Tuesday, I reminded her. You had my things loaded into a truck and sent to a facility that smelled like a hospital basement. You didn't worry about where I'd sleep. That was for your own good, she yelled, drawing looks from the other guests in the lobby. No, I said, leaning forward. That was for your office. It was for your convenience. And now, this is for my security. David put his head in his hands. Dad, please. If the bank moves forward with the foreclosure, my reputation in the legal community is finished. I can't have a public filing like this. I'll lose my partnership track. I looked at my son. He wasn't worried about me. He wasn't even worried about his mother's memory. He was worried about his partnership track. The boy I had worked 60-hour weeks for was gone, replaced entirely by this hollow man in an expensive suit. You have 28 days left, I said, standing up. I suggest you start talking to a realtor. Or maybe Sarah's wealthy friends can lend you the balance. After all, that's what families do for each other, right? You're a monster, Sarah whispered, her face twisted in rage. I'm a father who finally stopped saying yes, I replied. I walked toward the elevators without looking back. I could hear Sarah starting to scream at David in the middle of the lobby, blaming him for not reading the fine print years ago. I realized then that their marriage was built on the same shaky foundation they had tried to build their life on: greed and appearances. And now that the money was gone, the walls were starting to crumble. The next week was a blur of phone calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Sarah had contacted my old neighbors back in Georgia, telling them I had lost my mind and was trying to destroy my only son. She even had David's oldest daughter, my granddaughter Emma, call me. I could hear Sarah whispering in the background as Emma cried into the phone, asking why I was taking their house away. It was a level of manipulation that turned my heart to stone. I didn't back down. I met with Harold again, and we discovered that David had tried to file an emergency injunction to stop the foreclosure. He had argued that I was mentally unfit to manage my affairs. But Harold was prepared. He produced the medical evaluation I'd undergone the day I moved into the hotel, a full cognitive assessment that proved I was as sharp as the day I started on the docks. They're desperate, Robert, Harold told me. The firm found out about the lien. David isn't on the partnership track anymore. He's on the chopping block. They don't want the scandal of a senior partner's family being embroiled in a predatory lawsuit against their own father. By the 20th day, the house was officially listed for a short sale. Sarah and David had realized no one was coming to save them. They had to sell just to cover the bank's primary mortgage and the $300,000 they owed me. The high ceilings and desert views were being traded for a frantic scramble to find a rental they could actually afford. I drove past the house one last time on a Tuesday evening. I saw David standing in the driveway, looking at a stack of boxes. It was the same driveway where he had stood silent while Sarah told me I wasn't welcome. Now the roles were reversed. He saw my car and took a step forward, his hand raised as if he wanted to stop me. But I didn't slow down. I had already signed the lease on a small, quiet cottage near the coast in South Carolina. It was far from the desert, far from the polished marble and the cold eyes of a daughter-in-law who saw me as a burden. My things were already being moved out of the storage unit and shipped across the country. On the 29th day, David called me one last time. His voice didn't have the anger anymore. He just sounded hollow. "We're out, Dad," he said. "We're moving into a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town Sarah hates. I hope you're happy. You got what you wanted. You got your money." "It was never about the money, David," I said. "It was about the fact that you were willing to let me rot in a state home to save a few dollars in a home office." "You didn't just lose the house. You lost the only person who would have given you everything for nothing." He didn't have an answer for that. He just hung up, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to call him back to make things right. Some things can't be fixed with an apology. The coast of South Carolina was exactly what I needed. The air was thick with salt and the slow, steady rhythm of the tide, a far cry from the dry, suffocating silence of that house in Scottsdale. I spent my mornings on the porch of my cottage, watching the birds over the marsh and drinking coffee that I made for myself, in a kitchen where I was truly the master of the house. The closing on the Scottsdale house had been finalized. After the bank took their share and my lien was satisfied, David and Sarah were left with almost nothing. The $300,000 sat in my new account, but I didn't feel like a rich man. I felt like a survivor. I had used a small portion of it to settle into this life, and the rest was destined for a trust that David would never see. A month after I moved, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was from Emma. I hesitated before opening it, expecting more of Sarah's coached vitriol. Instead, it was a short, messy note written on notebook paper. She told me they were living in the apartment now and that things were loud all the time. She said David and Sarah didn't talk anymore. They only shouted about who was to blame for the debt. She asked if I still had the chess set I used to play with her. I sat there for a long time, looking at that letter. I thought about the cycle of greed that had eaten my son alive and the collateral damage it had left behind in his children. I could have reached out. I could have offered a hand to Emma. But then I remembered the way David stood by and watched those movers load my life into a truck. I remembered the way he chose a home office over his own father's dignity. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't write back. One evening, as the sun was dipping below the horizon, my phone rang. It was David. I didn't answer. He didn't leave a voicemail this time. He just sent a single text message that read, "I'm sorry, Dad, please." I looked at the message for a second. Then I deleted it. I walked out to the edge of the water and watched the tide come in, erasing the footprints I'd left in the sand earlier that afternoon. I realized that some structures are built so poorly from the start that they aren't worth saving. You just have to let them fall and walk away before they pull you down with them. I went back inside and locked my door. The house was quiet, and for the first time in 72 years, that was exactly how I wanted it. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.